desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Number 160, printed in Part A of House Report Number 118-216, offered by Mr. Gaetz of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This Congress has authorized $115 billion to Ukraine. My amendment would ensure that this defense appropriations bill sends no more. $115 billion is an astonishing amount of money, especially when you consider that our nation sits atop a $33 trillion debt, and we are facing $2 trillion annual deficits. And it is not as if the $115 billion has brought this conflict any closer to an end. In fact, the massacres and the killing and the death continue. The next statement is so obvious, I can't even believe I have to say it out loud. It does not make the United States of America stronger to borrow money from China to give it to Ukraine. I hear a lot of the war hawks in this Congress stand up and say, well, we have to send a message to China by fighting for however long it takes at whatever cost in Ukraine. The message we're sending to China is that they are engaged in a leveraged buyout of Russia and increasingly of our own country. We've got problems here in America with our own borders. Americans are watching as foreign flags are being erected in the middle of the Rio Grande River while our nation is being invaded tens of thousands every month. And yet we go spend all this money on the border of another country. I do not fear broken Russian tanks rolling through Europe. I fear Russia's nuclear weapons and the risk that we could be sleepwalking into a nuclear conflict that could end life as we know it on the planet, all for what? To live out some neoconservative dream in Ukraine? Give me a break. Right now, a lot of this funding that we've sent for Ukraine has been inflationary. Food and fuel. These are the markets that have been affected globally because of this crisis and because of the money we are spending to extend the conflict. At the beginning of this Congress, Speaker McCarthy said, there's not going to be a blank check to Ukraine. But when we bring witnesses before us to ask them whether or not we're complying with our own laws regarding end-use monitoring of materiel, they cannot say we're even following our own laws. Enough is enough. I'm putting my countrymen first, and I don't think we should send another nickel to Ukraine. I reserve.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Here again is an attempt to cut off any support for Ukraine as they fight to defend their country from an illegal Russian invasion. As I said earlier, once again, Putin is attempting to rewrite the map of Europe through the use of force. He's doing so in violation of international law. He is deliberately targeting civilians, as I mentioned, hospitals, daycare centers, apartment buildings. And while he's doing that, yes, he is destroying the economy and the livelihood of Ukrainians in the process. Putin and his thugs, they are committing war crimes on a mass scale. And the United States and the other democratic nations of the world must continue to oppose him. If we do not, then he or another authoritarian leader will try something like this again. Yes, either in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world. Earlier I mentioned, I laid out that America is not alone in its support of Ukraine. Our allies and our partners are donating tanks, air defense systems, artilleries, vehicles, rockets, and infantry fighting vehicles. And this list goes on and on. So let's not abandon our fellow democracies. Let's not abandon the EU and our NATO allies now. Let's not abandon Ukraine. Faced with daunting odds against Russian forces, they have taken up a mantle to defend themselves, defend their values, and our shared democratic principles. They deserve our continued support. So I understand that my colleague has a different view than I do, but I thank him for a respectful engagement in this discussion, and I urge my colleagues at this time to oppose this amendment. And, Madam Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And indeed, this is a respectful policy dispute that we have over this matter, and I am grateful that we are taking up the Defense Appropriations Bill as a single subject bill to work through these things and let the votes fall where they may. But it seems the full sum of the argument against my amendment is Putin bad, which I concede. Matter of fact, Vladimir Putin has sanctioned me personally. So I don't have to be sold on that argument. He's a bad guy. The question is whether after $115 billion, it's the $300 million in this bill that's going to really kick the door in. And there's been no argument that that's the case because, of course, that would not comport with logic and reason. And when my colleagues say we cannot abandon the EU, that is like fingernails on a chalkboard to my fellow Americans who often feel like they are the ones who have been abandoned. As we send $115 billion to Ukraine and ignore what is going on our own border. We also ignore what's going on with a lot of our first responders. In our country, there are police and firemen who do not know if their pension fund will be strong enough to support their benefits throughout their life. We do very little on that front, but we have underwritten the full pension of every civil servant and government employee in Ukraine. Abandon them. I just don't think we should bankroll them. And that's why I would encourage the adoption of my amendment. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I rise as a designee of the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Granger. And Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment, which prohibits security assistance for Ukraine. The bill contains funding and conditions for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is different from the funding that has been included in supplementals for Ukraine. This funding is not sent directly to Ukraine. Rather, it pays for training and procurement of U.S. equipment. Congress has funded this initiative every single year since it was authorized in 2016 during both Democrat and Republican administrations. Just last month, the House voted to authorize this funding at the same level. Madam Chair, this assistance and the partnership between Ukraine and the California National Guard is what enabled the Ukrainians to beat back the Russian invasion and greatly diminish Russia's conventional military forces. I've been very clear to the Department, no blank checks. That was why this bill contains many new oversight provisions and funding for a Special Inspector General for Ukraine, if authorized in the final NDAA. The gentleman has often noted that funds used in support of Ukraine should go to securing our southern border. I argue that we should secure the border and partner with Ukraine to degrade Russia while never taking our eye off China. We do not yet know how the war will play out, but I do know that voting for this amendment would send the wrong message at the wrong time. I urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arkansas yields back. The gentleman from Florida has, the gentleman from Florida has 1 minute remaining.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So the argument my colleague made is, well, we've always sent this $300 million. And that may be true, but we used to send that $300 million when we weren't sending $100 billion supplementals on top of that. So I don't think that argument really holds water. And then when my colleague says, well, we can do both. We can secure Ukraine's border and we can secure our border. My argument would be, can we at least secure our own border first? How about that? How about prioritize our own people first before we start engaging in misadventures throughout Europe? I reserve.
How much time? The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Madam Chair, may I inquire as to how much time I have left?
The gentlewoman has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman from Arkansas, who struck the last word, and also spoke on behalf of the chair of the full Appropriations Committee. I had the pleasure of being with Mr. Womack in Poland, where we did oversight of the very money that we're talking about right now. And what we watched was, and I've been in other theaters where we were supporting other troops, the enthusiasm, the commitment, the dedication that we saw from the Ukrainians who were under our supervision, getting ready to receive training, was outstanding. It was like nothing else I've ever seen before. And we do need to do our due diligence, and that's one of the reasons why I opposed an earlier amendment, which would have actually restricted the military from escorting us on those types of codels into the future. This is something that, in my years in Congress and working on many international foreign affairs issues, when I was in Germany just before at the conference, just before the Ukrainian invasion took place, I have never in my life seen the democracies so united to work together because they know of the threat of what's happening. And they want to make sure, and we want to make sure, that we continue to give the Ukrainians the support they deserve. I have a friend who's returning home from just visiting, and her cousin's going back after taking some R&R after being wounded. And, you know, the stories that she's sharing and the stories that I've heard from other people in Ukraine, you know, everybody is participating. 60-year-olds are driving the tanks because they can't be out there in the front line. And they're doing that, and they're able to do that because of the support and the equipment and the training that we've given them, not only to fight against Russia, but also to maintain the equipment they have. So I thank the gentleman for striking the last word and speaking to this. And we need to do our due diligence to make sure that the oversight is done right. But I do not support Mr. Gaetz's amendment as offered today. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman has the right to close. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The United States of America is not the world's piggy bank, and we are not the world's policeman. I applaud all of the enthusiasm in Ukraine. I am rooting for them, but enthusiasm in this country is waning to continue to support all of that effort abroad. We want to secure our border. We want to see enthusiasm with our border patrol, and we do not support continued inflationary, escalatory, dangerous spending in this war in Ukraine. I thank the House's indulgence for considering my amendment. I would encourage its adoption, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman for this respectful debate, and I yield back any balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The questions